Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for hanging with us for a moment. I really appreciate it. As everyone continues to sign in and get their audio set, I will introduce myself. I'm Dr. Liz Watts-Maluhos. I am the section head of Collaborative Research Liaison at the I am the section head of Collaborative Research Engagement, and I'm also the Collaborative Research Liaison. That's what I meant to say, at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. So I will be the moderator for today's lecture. I have a terrible cold, so I hope you all will bear with how I sound today. On behalf of organizer Dr. Erin Benson, welcome and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We are really excited to introduce a new take on our spring speaker series this year, focusing on collaborative research with a lecture today by Dr. Brooke Morgan and Logan Pappenfort. This series is being supported by funds from the Office of the State Archaeologist and ISAS's Collaborative Research Engagement section. ISAS is a division of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. With over 70 full-time archaeologists and support staff working at field stations throughout the state, ISAS is one of the largest archaeological research institutions in the U.S. And I want to take a moment to say that ISAS recognizes that its offices on the University of Illinois campus in Urbana-Champaign and its field stations that I mentioned elsewhere in the state of Illinois are on the lands of the Delaware, Ho-Chunk, Iowa, Kaw, Kickapoo, Miami, Menominee, Meskwaki, Odawa, Ojibwe, Omaha, Osage, Oto, Missouri, Peoria, Ponca, Potawatomi, Quapaw, Sauk, Shawnee, Winnebago, and other Native nations. ISAS acknowledges the histories of forced removal of these nations from their homelands and dispossession from their cultural sites and material culture. ISAS is committed to building partnerships and collaborating with Native nations on the study, protection, and promotion of their cultural heritage. On behalf of the state archaeologist and director of ISAS, Dr. Timothy Pocketat, today we are honored to host Dr. Morgan and Mr. Pappenfort. And a little bit about our speakers today before I hand it over to them. Dr. Brooke Morgan is the curator of Anthropology and NAGPRA contact at the Illinois State Museum in Springfield, Illinois. And Logan Pappenfort is a citizen of the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma and the curator of Anthropology and interim director of the Dickson Mounds Museum in Lewiston, Illinois, which is part of the Illinois State Museum system. Since their arrivals, Dr. Morgan and Mr. Pappenfort have been working to reinterpret collections, strengthen tribal relationships, and prioritize the repatriation of cultural objects and ancestral remains held at the Illinois State Museum to descendant communities in the United States and internationally. We are pleased to have them here speaking on their work together with the Illinois State Museum collections. I will now turn it over to Brooke and Logan, and please submit questions you have for our speakers in the chat, and a question and answer session will follow the lecture as time allows. So thank you all. Let me stop sharing my screen. And I'll go ahead and mute. Thanks, Brooke and Logan.
Thanks, Liz. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I will start sharing my screen so we can get that going. All right, and I'll just introduce myself. Again, as Liz said, I'm the curator of anthropology at the Illinois State Museum. We're located in Springfield, Illinois, and I work out of our Research and Collection Center. I also serve as the museum's NAGPRA contact, and I've been here almost 6 years. I'm an archaeologist by training and have largely gotten my museum training and collections training on the job. And so when I started in 2018, I recognized immediately that rebuilding some of our tribal partnerships and furthering our NAGPRA work was going to be of paramount importance, which is one thing we'll be talking about today. So I'll turn it over to Logan to introduce himself.
Hiya, Chekiawea, Tepewe Neala Kokoke, Logan Pappenfort Winswayane, Nile Pewalia. So Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. My name is Logan Pappenfort, and I am a Peoria tribal citizen. I'm a member of the Peoria Nation, and I have been here as the Curator of Anthropology at Dickson Mounds for 2.5 years now. And before that, I was the Director of Cultural Preservation at the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. And through that work, I came into contact with many lovely people in the ancestral homelands of the Peoria, which is Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. I'm very excited to be able to talk about the collaboration that we have done and will continue to do. And my background is I'm an archaeologist, and I got into this line of work in an effort to better understand the deep history of my people, and in order to bring my perspective as an Indigenous person to the field. And so through that work, I not only gained a deeper understanding of my people's history, but also a deeper understanding of the landscape as well. And with that wordy introduction out of the way, I am more than happy to get on with the presentation and share what me and Brooke are here to talk about today.
Thanks, Logan. We are going to focus on our work at Dickson Mounds Museum, which we'll give you a little bit of an overview of before we dive into the kinds of collaborative work that we've been doing. And you'll notice the title is Controversy to Collaboration, because Dickson Mounds is a sort of ground zero for a lot of the things that happened in the 90s surrounding legislation, whether it was NAGPRA or the state burial law. And it was very, there were very public demonstrations, and it was sort of caught up in this very big cultural moment. So just a little bit of background in way of the archaeology. The Dickson Mounds site, you can see there on the left-hand side. It is in the central Illinois River Valley and dates to about 1000 to 1300, part of the Mississippian period, what is often referred to as the Spoon River Mississippian. And all those dots on the map on the left-hand side are mound centers that are in the central Illinois River Valley. Dickson Mounds itself is interesting because it is a cemetery in every sense of the word, and there is a village nearby next to the mounds that is known as the Meyer-Dickson site, but the village itself was not large enough to be able to sustain enough people who were actually interred in the mounds. So we believe that folks were being buried in the mounds from probably all over the central Illinois River Valley. And that place was returned to time and time again. And actually the burials themselves start in the terminal late woodland period. Just for reference as to where you are, if you are not familiar with Illinois geography, Springfield is that center nexus, and then to the northeast of that big spot there on the interstate is Bloomington Normal. And so on the right, you can see an overview of an aerial of Dickson Mounds, and that's what the building looks like today. So the property itself came into the Dickson family during the Civil War after being reserved as part of a military tract. This was given to veterans of the War of 1812 in order to encourage settlement of these rural areas. So the Dickson family moved onto this property, and ever since they established their homestead there, there were inadvertent encounters of human remains and funerary objects throughout the farm, both on the mounds themselves, but there were, the whole landform essentially is an archaeological site. And the site itself was subject to modern disturbances like land clearing, tilling, pot hunting. It wasn't as if this site was unknown by Euro-American settlers. It certainly was. It's a prominent place on the landscape, on a bluff overlooking the Illinois River Valley. So it was well known. And what changes is in 1927, Dr. Don Dickson, who is a chiropractor, began his what he referred to or thought of as purposeful excavations. And by that, I mean that there was not a, his goal was essentially to excavate and learn about the remains, the people that he was excavating. It was not in an attempt to necessarily retrieve the items they were buried with, as most pot hunting was at the time. He viewed his work differently, with a different lens. So that started in 1927, and what you can see behind as the background is basically, you know, a canvas pup tent, and that was the beginning of the excavations, were this small tent, and you can see the back of Don Dickson there. What this leads to is really there's this perfect storm. In 1927, there is a lot going on in terms of people's interest in the past. In 1926, Howard Carter found King Tut's tomb. And so that was, you know, the Egypt craze and Egyptology was big in the mind of Americans, and this obsession with antiquity. Automobiles also become more affordable, and the family road trip is essentially born around this era. Route 66 opens in 1926 and really connects a lot of the country in a way that it hadn't been connected before. You also have disposable income, or more disposable income than had been had previously. So people are able to take these weekend trips, and sort of just driving was part of the trip itself. And why is this all important at this point? Well, the commercialization of Dickson Mounds began almost immediately. So as I said, Don Dickson began his excavations in 1927. You can see this tile building here with, it says entrance to tombs on it. This permanent building is constructed in 1928. So within a year of Don Dickson opening the mounds and charging an admission fee, he's able to fund further excavations, but also fund a permanent building. In 1929, he ends his excavations, and what he had done was essentially expose the remains of at least at that time, he thought 234 individuals. They were exposed, the dirt was removed, and they were left in situ or in place, along with the items with which they were buried. And so this became, you know, a roadside attraction. Obviously, it's not how we like to think of, you know, either human remains or ancestral remains or these very sacred places, but that's what it was at the time. And it certainly wasn't the only one, but it was the most successful. There are mound sites throughout the central Illinois River Valley. Others tried to sort of follow the Dickson model and capitalize on mound excavations, but really Dickson Mounds was the most successful of them. Of course, we then have, you know, shortly after or while the Dickson excavation is being completed, the stock market crashes. There's an immediate downturn in activity, in visitorship, and then eventually with World War II, there's just not as much demand to come see Dickson Mounds as this sort of roadside attraction. So the Dickson sold the site to the state of Illinois in 1945, and it was added to the state park system. That means that it was not considered a museum. It was not considered a state historic site. It was run as a park, and with essentially you would get entrance to the tombs, as they were called, and then there was a concession that the Dicksons ran. So this continues for about 20 years, it being part of the state park system, and then the site was added to the Illinois State Museum portfolio in 1965. And that is why it is part of our one of our branches today, is that it is part of the Illinois State Museum. And a new building was approved by the 74th General Assembly in 1965. They wanted to modernize the museum experience, recognizing that if it's going to be part of the museum system, then it needs a proper museum building. Unfortunately, what this meant was that the building was going to be put directly on top of all of the mounds that were on the site. You could see in this overhead, this aerial, everything outlined in this purple were excavations that took place between 1966. Some testing was done, but really they began in earnest in 1967 through 1970, 1971. And the entire site was impacted, right? This building was not here. All that was there was what we call the south wing of the building, which is here highlighted as the pre-1970 museum building, and that was the Dickson building. So that was the southernmost mound. That was under a building, but then the rest of the building, where the rest of the building is now, those were still intact mounds. Unfortunately, with the decision to build the museum on top of the mounds had to be had to undergo salvage excavation. So beginning in 1967, every single mound is impacted. Even you can see this one out to the right or to the east on the map. There's a trench that ran through it. So part of that mound is still largely intact, but it was impacted as well. So all mounds are impacted, and over 800 individuals are removed from their graves in the mounds. The building as it is now opened in 1972, and the Dickson excavation was still on view in the south wing. So 1972, it was not thought of as we're building this museum to close a wing. We're actually going to build this and incorporate the wing of the museum that is showing ancestral remains. Ironically, Dickson Mounds was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972 for its value as a mound site. I say this is ironic because it was placed on the National Register after nearly every single mound was destroyed. So from 1972 to about 1992, it was fewer than 20 years, really. The ancestors in their in situ, in position, burial positions were on display and open to the public. This place was seen as, you know, a place that school trips would go to. You know, it was family trips, and you know, the center point was seeing these the ancestral remains. And then in the late 80s to early 90s, really a lot of things come to a head at once. You have, of course, the passage of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, in 1990. In 1989, you have the passage of the state burial law, which protects unmarked graves and unregistered graves and grave items in the state from being just undergoing wanton destruction. But the burial exhibit itself was still open. And so, Logan, I don't know if you want to chime in and talk about the history there, being at Dickson Mounds. Logan's coming to you from Dickson today, and where I'm in Springfield. So I'll turn to him and see if he'd like to talk about sort of the tensions that arose during this period.
So yeah, there was a lot of tension that was going on in this period between Native American groups as well as the community here. And it actually came from the fact that both of these communities felt a certain amount of attachment and ownership over the site. Obviously, that type of ownership is one that is absolutely in favor of tribal nations. However, as the community in this area it is understandable how there could be some level of attachment. So by compromising in this way and closing the burial exhibit in the true nature of a compromise where nobody is 100% happy, when the burial exhibit was closed, the ancestors were not actually covered in earth, and that cedar floor was over them. And so for tribal communities, while they were not truly at rest, they also were at least not on active display to the public. And in the same way, while that community had essentially this exhibit that they had some level of attachment to changing, it was not at the time closed in the same way that they might have feared. And so it's very, very complicated feelings when visiting this place for tribal citizens. Even today, there's a lot of mixed feelings, but at the core of it, I think the point is in the 90s when this controversy happened, the state did respond to the feedback from tribal nations and did the right thing in closing this exhibit and no longer letting the ancestors be exposed in that way, and showed some respect to them in that way.
Yeah, and the wing still remained open. The museum reopened in 1994, having redone a lot of the archaeology exhibits, actually creating many archaeology exhibits for the first time, because there was a need to rely on something that was not the burial exhibit. But the space in the south wing, as Logan said, was covered, and then it was the area was repurposed into an audiovisual sort of voiceover talking about Native worldviews, and it was like that for quite some time. It was kind of supposed to be a place of healing or reconciliation, but you know, there's still the matter of all of the ancestors who were under the floor and then also had been removed from the mounds. What this paves the way for is in 1995, because of NAGPRA, there were consultation meetings held at the Illinois State Museum and at Dickson Mounds Museum with tribal nations who had treaty lands in Illinois. And I specify treaty lands because that means any of the tribes who essentially were here most recently and agreed to sign away parcels of land, tracts of land. We know that there are many contemporary tribes who trace their ancestry and their homelands to Illinois, but left either long before European contact or did not sign treaties, or you know, there are many other reasons why folks may have not had treaty lands in the state. But at the time, that's what was chosen as the sort of the groups that were brought together to do consultation. A result of this was the return of more than 120 ancestors and 32,000 funerary objects, including lots and lots and lots of tiny seed beads, to the Peoria tribe. And these all date to the 17th and 18th centuries. And I want to turn it to Logan to talk more about the Peoria tribe and that repatriation and what it meant to the tribe.
So this was an incredibly critical moment for the Peoria Nation, because for the first time we were getting to have our ancestors returned, as well as our associated objects, which yes, did include a quite large number of seed beads to us. And at the time when this is happening, it's a very different process to how NAGPRA works today. So I think one thing I want to mention and make sure that everybody understands about this process is at the time that these ancestors and objects were repatriated, there was not confidence from the Peoria Nation that reburial would be able to happen in the ancestral homeland in Illinois. And so what ended up happening is the Peoria tribe took those ancestors back to Oklahoma with them to be reburied in our tribal cemetery. And the reason we did that is because the last thing we wanted to do was to try and rebury these ancestors in some location in Illinois and they be disturbed once again. So the decision was made to bring them back to an area that we would have direct control over, where they're still interred to this day. And in addition to that, what we did with the objects from these various sites was we essentially made a Peoria Tribe archaeological collection utilizing these objects. And so these seed beads, these different various artifacts are now essentially all together and can be studied and looked at into the future, as well as treated in the proper and respectful way under the direction of the tribe itself. And so in that way, the tribe had agency over its own objects where it just did not have that before. And what that also did is allowed us to enter into a long-standing relationship with the Illinois State Museum in the form of a curation agreement. This is one example of some of the relationships that NAGPRA can help build when done in the right way. And Brooke, if you want to expand a little bit on that, just to touch on it.
Sure.
The agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. The cooperative agreement or curation agreement that Logan referred to really was sort of precedent setting and groundbreaking in a way, because it was established in 2000. The main repatriation to the Peoria tribe took place in 1997, 1998. And at that time, the tribe decided not to rebury all of the returned funerary items. And so this is a unique situation, and one that I think is, the right people were working on this at the right time to have these conversations and understand the importance of these items, because they're a direct testament to the Peoria and Kaskaskias and other tribes who are now part of the Peoria tribe. It is a direct testament to their time in what is now Illinois. And so these were seen as very, very important and could be used to learn from. They could be used to understand relatives who've gone before. And so we entered into this cooperative agreement that, as Logan said, the tribe is under complete control of the collection. It is their collection. They own it. We curate or manage it for them on their behalf, but any requests for the collection have to go through the tribe and through the business committee. And so there have been a couple of non-destructive analyses of some of the items, especially the beads, that were approved by the business committee. There was another project that was proposed that was not approved because even at the time, the damage was thought to be, microscopic, but to the business committee, they decided that was too much of a risk to take, and so decided not to pursue that or approve that research. And so authority and agency completely lies with the tribe. And so the agreement was, as I said, established in 2000, renewed in 2012. And we're updating it now. We're revisiting some of the things that have come to light. When this was established, there was not a lot regarding the digital assets, whether that's photographs or scans, things like that. And that's definitely something now that we have to think about and figure out a way to manage those as well. So we're working closely with the Peoria Tribe's Cultural Preservation Office in order to make those appropriate updates.
And yeah, I want to speak just real briefly about the research requests that go through the business committee, because I think this is something that is really important, which is creating an avenue for ethical research to be done. And so, for example, one of the stances for the Peoria tribe has always been destructive analysis, no matter the form, is not something that the tribe is willing to do. And that's because, as a removal tribe, we have a very limited amount of cultural material from our ancestral homeland, and it's just something that the tribe was not willing to take a risk on in that nature, especially because this is, for us, a very non-renewable resource. And so it really has given the tribe agency over how research is done in regard to its own collection. And it's something that I'm extremely proud of as a citizen of the Peoria Nation. So.
So that's essentially, I mean, there were some other repatriation activities, but really the bulk of it was the late 90s, early 2000s, and forming those partnerships or those relationships were with essentially the previous generation. So Logan's going to talk about 30 years later and where that brings us to today, and how we are sitting before you.
So obvious elephant in the room, me nor Brooke were there 30 years ago when these conversations were happening. As Brooke mentioned, that she started in 2018. I started at the tribe in 2015. And so 2018 was a very important year for the Peoria Nation because we had a new chief was elected during this time. And that new chief, Chief Craig Harper, he wanted, when he got into office, to establish relationships with previous partners that former administrations had relationships with. And one of the foremost of those was the Illinois State Museum. So at that time, I was the director of cultural preservation, and the task was put to me to reach out to the Illinois State Museum and essentially create a trip to go up and visit our collection. And I had worked with various staff members at the Illinois State Museum previously before this, but only for small incidental emails here and there. So I didn't have a good point of contact to reach out to. So what I decided to do was look up who was there at that time. And I picked up the phone and called the Research and Collection Center. And on the other end of that phone was Dr. Brooke Morgan. And I introduced myself. At the time, I was second chief of the Peoria Nation. And I said, me and Chief Harper would like to come up and visit the Illinois State Museum as well as visit our collection. And to that, the answer was, of course, they were happy to provide us an avenue to visit our collection, and as well as that, see even beyond our collection. And so this was the first time I ever met Brooke, and I also at this time met Dwayne Essery, who's the former director of Dickson Mounds Museum. And this was the beginning of a new chapter in this relationship between the tribe and the State Museum. And I'll kind of hand it over to Brooke to talk about how that relationship expanded from that initial meeting.
Yeah, it was my first year of being here. I was dealing with a lot of things. We have a very large collection, archaeological and ethnographic, at the Illinois State Museum. So I'm kind of, getting my feet under me, learning the history of the institution, and I get cold called by the second chief of the Peoria tribe, which I think is just like the best thing ever. It's like, this is fantastic. This is, it was really exciting. And so after that visit, we stayed in touch. We talked. We obviously worked on some NAGPRA related instances. But I want to talk about the images here that are shared on this slide. This was a very, very special moment for us at the museum, and goes to show how quickly and significantly we can build these partnerships. So Logan and Chief Harper first visited in February of 2019. And these pictures were taken in October of 2019. And what you see here is a delegation of Aboriginal Australian men who have come to the Illinois State Museum to claim their cultural items and take them back to Australia. There are 2 Aboriginal communities represented, and that's another story for another day. It's a fantastic story, but the reason why Logan's involved is because in Australia and the Torres Strait Islands, it is incredibly important to have something called a welcome to country. We kind of think of it as a land acknowledgement, but really it's not. It's actually something that happened and continues to happen between Indigenous groups. And it's essentially, you cannot enter someone's territory or land until you are formally welcomed as guests and allowed to be there. And the men who came from Australia indicated to us that they would only really be comfortable with continuing this process and this project if someone from one of the Indigenous communities in Illinois was able to welcome them to country. So I was like, okay, I'll see what I can do, knowing that Illinois is a removal state. Most of our tribal partners are located quite a ways away. So I called Logan, and I explained the situation, and he immediately said yes, that he'd make it happen. And so he drove from Miami, Oklahoma to Springfield, Illinois, to essentially spend maybe half a day and then turn around and drive back just to welcome these men to Illinois. And, it went a long way in making them feel comfortable and welcome, but also showing, how our relationship between the tribe and the institution had already sort of been reinvigorated just in that short time period.
And I was incredibly honored to be able to come up and welcome these visitors into our ancestral homeland, because this was not only a moment of repatriation and reconciliation for them, but it was also a moment of having the respect to have the state essentially ask us to come up and do such a welcome. And so I was extremely honored and privileged. So that's why when I got the request, I had no issue whatsoever driving up to Illinois, giving that welcome, and then having to drive right back down to Oklahoma for other business. And it is something that I was honored to be a part of and would absolutely have done again in a heartbeat. And I want to also talk about some collaboration that is on the right here, that is an assistance that the State Museum helped the tribe with. And so this is essentially a map of our occupational territory, as well as many of our village sites, as well as overlaid with our treaty land. And so this is a map that was made in collaboration with myself, Brooke, and Dwayne Essery to essentially assist the Peoria tribe with its work in preserving our sites in Illinois. So whenever I got a project from through historic preservation, Section 106, anything that considers a federal undertaking, I essentially could reference this map to make sure that there weren't any of our major village sites being affected. And so this is another one of those things that is a collaboration that benefits both parties. And the only way we get to this point is by that continued relationship that really originated out of doing NAGPRA effectively.
So turning back to Dickson Mounds, Dwayne and I had long conversations about how to move our NAGPRA work forward in a way that is going to be, you know, sort of a watershed moment for the museum in the sense that it would establish a new baseline from which to continue NAGPRA work, right, on essentially a massive scale, but also to work on reinterpretation and all these other aspects of the site and the museum itself with tribal partners. And so in 2020, we were reflecting on what the best possible path forward would be, and really the only answer was Dickson Mounds. Like, we have to start with Dickson Mounds, the ancestors from that site. It's an unfinished chapter. Many of our tribal partners or you know, indigenous people that we work with see it as an open wound because it's not, you know, there was resolution sort of in the 90s, but those ancestors that are in the South Wing, which is the leftmost wing on the building, and yeah, here, laser pointer. Yeah, that's the South Wing. So the ancestors are under there. And then the others that had been removed from excavation, you know, they were still not at rest. And so we decided to start this project in 2020. This was prior to Logan joining the museum. He was actually on the other side of the table as the Peoria tribe's representative. But we started this in 2020, and I'll talk more about that timeline in a minute. But it was clear that we could not ask our tribal partners to work on exhibits or work on outreach, work on programming. We could not establish those or build those relationships without first addressing the biggest issue, which is the repatriation of Dickson Mounds. And so this whole series, which again, thank you for thinking of us and allowing us to join, is about collaboration. And so in collaborating with tribal partners, I really want to drive home the point that it's not just working together, right? I mean, we hear collaboration thrown around a lot, like, oh, we're collaborating with another institution, we're collaborating with another museum, we're collaborating with a colleague, but really, you know, you're working together to complete a task or achieve a goal. And that is the biggest point of this, is that we were all working, whether we were on the museum side, whether we're on with the tribal nations, we're all working towards the same goal, working towards that consultation and repatriation. And so I just listed a few things that sort of drove our collaborative process. And the first of which is intentionality. This was not an exercise in just making sure that, you know, we legally met the requirements of what we needed to do under NAGPRA. It was much more than that. It was much deeper. And everything that we did was with intentionality. So whether that was, you know, something that came out of our discussions and consultation, or whether it was how we decided we were going to address an issue that arose, how we were going to communicate with tribes, everything was done with this intentionality, and also mindfulness. Working in collections or working with data sets, or, you know, you can get a little used to working with or just viewing collections as things, as static. But, you know, this mindfulness and respectfulness for the fact that these are people's relatives, and they are their items that were buried with them, and making sure that, you know, you don't get too bogged down in all the details. And if you do, you need to step back and kind of rethink what we're working on and what we're working for. Mutual respect, of course, and open communication, those go hand in hand as well. We want to be as transparent as possible during this, because a lot of this is painful. And I you know, whether it is for the tribal nations that we work with, or, you know, the not just those representatives, but also the elders or councils that they have to report to and talk about this process. We know that it can be a very, very painful to learn about the history of the site, and also how their relatives had been treated. Yeah, Logan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and so I think, you bring up some amazing points about the intentionality of this process, but I think it's important to realize that this is a process that has that purpose behind it, and that purpose and mutual respect is really critical. But that mutual respect expands beyond just tribal partners and to the institution that's doing the NAGPRA work, but it's also mutual respect for the ancestors themselves. As we have gone through this process, one thing we've always kept at the front of our mind is to have empathy when working with these collections, and to make sure that when we are working on returning these ancestors to where they need to be, that we keep in mind that these individuals are relatives of our tribal partners, and as such, they deserve to be treated with the utmost respect, just how we would want anyone else to be treated. And so it's always important to think, when you're going through a long process like this that can be very taxing on the individuals doing the work, that all we can really do is do that next right thing in our chain of a long process over a period of time. And I am extremely proud of the relationship that we have fostered as a result of this, but also in that intentional work that the State Museum has done and continues to do.
I see we're getting a little short on time, so I'm going to speed up through in the next couple slides. But this is just to give you a sense of, that forest removal has ongoing impacts. And we may hear from the public, well, why are you talking to tribes who are in Oklahoma? Or why are you talking to tribes who are in Wisconsin? We do not have any federally recognized tribes headquartered in Illinois. And Illinois was the heart of many tribes' territories before colonization. But there are no reservation or allotted lands in Illinois for tribes currently. And so our consulting parties are spread across several states, either north in Michigan and Wisconsin, or to the west across the Mississippi in Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. So this is just one example of removal. This is Potawatomi removals, but every single tribe that we work with has other removal stories that it makes it a challenge sometimes to do NAGPRA work because of these complicated histories, and that our tribal partners are so far from the homelands. One aspect that we also needed to do during this process was collaborate with institutions and do our due diligence to make sure that we were returning everything from that had been from Dickson Mounds back to Dickson Mounds. So in this case here, you can see in the orange dots, those we received collections from 3 institutions who were holding Dickson Mounds ancestors and items. And then we also had loan or sample returns from 4 other institutions. And this just kind of shows you how sometimes there's a network. You may think you have an entire collection or have a good sense of what is in your collections, but actually getting those all back to where they belong may take some additional work. This is just to show you a bit of the timeline. So we're essentially at 3 years and counting. Our September 2020 is when the invitation to consult went out. And you can see that, it was not constant work every month, but certainly it picked up once we got our NAGPRA grant in August of 2021 and had our first intertribal virtual meeting in September of 2021. So from September to 2021, it took about 2.5 years, a little less than 2.5 years to submit our updated inventory and get that sent to National NAGPRA for review and publication. And today is banner day. We didn't plan this, but today our notice of inventory completion was published in the Federal Register. And that essentially means that the ancestors and their items from Dickson Mounds can be repatriated after a brief waiting period. So this is sort of the legislative or legal aspect of doing NAGPRA is you have to provide an inventory with summary information that meets the law, and then you wait 30 days to ensure there are no competing claims, and then repatriation can proceed. Repatriation doesn't necessarily mean reburial. It just means the transfer of legal control. So today begins our countdown until repatriation can occur, and it's just the next step in that process. So Logan, if you want to take it home with the collaborative efforts.
Yes, I'll try to get through this in an expedient way while still hitting all the points. So one of the takeaways here about collaboration is that it doesn't end here. It is a consistent process that we go through, and we do that next right thing. And so we have a very huge chapter that we are getting close to moving on to the next one with our notice being published today. But that does not mean our work stops. And so one of our main things is continuing this momentum and doing more and more NAGPRA work as we return more ancestors to where they need to be. Another one is, now that we have gotten some of the ancestors that we have at our site repatriated, potentially after the short waiting period, that we can start looking at things like working with tribal nations on exhibits and other collaborations. So one of those examples is right now, the Peoria Tribe Indians of Oklahoma has went out for a grant and is working on the Imicon Gallery, and that is a space at our museum which is essentially going to be at the direction of the Peoria on the history and the relationship of the landscape with the site, which is really exciting to be able to have that space for the Peoria to express their vision. And in that same vein, now what we can do is work with these tribal partners that we've established these relationships with and incorporate their traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge into the fiber of our exhibits going forward, as well as our program. And this will let us to tell a more holistic and complete understanding of not only the history of our site, but the history of the whole Illinois River Valley and Illinois at large. And so with this, none of this would be possible without us doing empathy-based archaeology and history, because as we're going forward and as we're trying to understand the history of Native people in the state, it is important to remember that we are dealing with people. And so whenever you're dealing with people, empathy should be one of the first things that you are trying to address. And so with our final takeaway being that our goal is for Dickson Mounds to be a center for holistic understanding about the 12,000 years of history we have in the Illinois River Valley, but not only just the history, but also how tribes live today in the contemporary setting. And so that would not be possible without the kind of collaboration that we've talked about today and will continue to do. And so with that, I just want to say mission Away to everybody, and thank you for listening to me and Dr. Morgan talk about the collaboration that we've done and will continue to do into the future.
Thank you, Brooke and Logan. That was incredible. And you took away all of the steam I had on questions for you, because you wrapped it up in such a beautiful way after sharing your collective story and your work together. So if folks have questions or comments, we've got about 3 minutes, so pop them in the chat, please. I guess one question I could ask is, what What are the most important things that you hope visitors take away after visiting Dickson Mounds?
I think for me, it's the significance of the space and how important this site is historically, but also even today. There is a presence to the site that's something that I've felt from the very moment I first stepped foot into the museum, and not even just the museum, but the area around it. I'd say I want people to take away to have a taste of what that significance is, even if they can't quite put their finger on it.
Brooke, do you want to weigh in at all on that from your
Oh,
perspective?
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think that Logan got it, and I also want it to be you know, it's more of my envision for what I envision for future takeaways, because we're kind of in a place where you know, things are going to be changing, but I want there to be we should be able to reflect, and visitors should be able to reflect that that modern tribal communities are especially important in helping make this work happen, and they are still here, and they have vibrant communities that just because they're not in Illinois doesn't mean that we shouldn't be bringing them in and learning from them. So I think making sure that we are sort of forward looking as well is going to be a huge part of like the eventual reinterpretation of Dickson Mounds.
Thank you. And we had more of a request, which I will second this, is that future workshops led by you two about archaeologists working to make tribal collaboration happen. I think that would be quite popular, especially after today's talk, which was really lovely. And unfortunately, we've got 1 minute left, so I have to do my official wrap up. So I'm gonna sorry. There we go. And say thank you so much to Brooke and Logan again, officially on behalf of the Prairie Research Institute and the Illinois State Archaeological Survey and the Office of the State Archaeologist. We are just so pleased to have you today. So thank you for coming in, sharing your story and your collaboration and your success with us. And congratulations on posting your notice of inventory. That's incredible. Congratulations to you both. I want to let everybody know that the lecture was recorded and it will be posted to the ISAS's YouTube page in a few days. And so you can see the rest of our spring series over the last few years, which if you go back to the first year, Logan Pappenfort was our very first speaker. So we were very excited to have him back again. And I will point you to our next event in the series, Monday, March 25th, 3 p.m. Central. See you on Zoom. We'll be hosting Marvin Defoe, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and Dr. Heather Walder, Assistant Teaching Professor of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. We hope to see everyone there. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a good evening, everyone.